It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. Now, we've yet to really touch upon the Heisei era of Godzilla, so that's what we're going to do this month. Each week this month, I'm going to talk about one of the movies from that middle era of the Godzilla franchise. Big G went from being a horror of nuclear energy and weaponry to a near superhero with young fans all over the world to a slightly darker, if not darker, more violent tone with the Mechagodzilla films to, well, simply dormant. At the conclusion of Terror of Mechagodzilla in 1975, Toho put their monster superstar on ice. But 9 years later, it was time for him to re-emerge. 1984's Godzilla is more commonly called the Return of Godzilla in most circles. Now, if you know some of the further stories of its U.S. release, then you know there is yet another name that we'll get to here momentarily. But the Return of Godzilla brings the behemoth back to his roots, a monster. All those Showa era of sequels are now wiped clean. 1984's Godzilla is a direct sequel to 1954's Godzilla. So let's dig into the development of this new era of Godzilla films a bit deeper. Terror of Mechagodzilla was a flop at the box office, and I'll talk more about that movie later in the year. But Toho shelved the series, but it wasn't without some consideration to try to reboot the whole thing as early as 1977. A color remake of the original was considered but shelved. Another idea was to make a movie called Godzilla vs. the Devil, and then have it follow up with a sequel, but that never really took off either. Now, 1979 marked Godzilla's 25th anniversary, and in the wake of the 3 Mile Island tragedy and the more mature science fiction like the 1976 King Kong, the 1978 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and 1979's Alien made for a decent reason to return Godzilla to his anti-nuclear weapon roots and return him to being more of a horror. Even Steve Miner, director of Friday the 13th Parts 2 and 3, got the okay from Toho to try his hand at making something. Fred Decker, who is best known for things like Night of the Creeps, The Monster Squad, and House, was brought in to write. But that project fell through when Miner was determined to make Godzilla a stop-motion animated creature. Producer Tomoyuki Tanaka was determined to separate Godzilla from the heroic kid-friendly version that we had seen through most of the 60s and into the 70s. He finally was able to get traction for a 30th anniversary film, and he did ask Ishiro Honda to return to his creation to direct, but Honda declined. Koji Hashimoto was then brought in to direct, and things were pretty much ready to happen. Godzilla was redesigned, and the special effects were going to be left to a team that had worked on many of the films in the past. The film was released in December of 1984 on a budget of about $6.25 million, and it ended up grossing about 2.9 billion yen, which would be somewhere around $27 million in U.S. currency. It was at best a moderate success, though maybe a little lackluster compared to some of Toho's hopes. Of course, the United States wanted in on this, so Roger Corman came along with New World Pictures, and they planned to distribute an English version called Godzilla 1985. Raymond Burr was brought in to reprise his role of Steve Martin from the original U.S. version of Godzilla King of the Monsters. Interestingly, New World thought about totally rewriting the dialogue and casting Leslie Nielsen to turn it more into a tongue-in-cheek comedy. And if you've ever seen Woody Allen's What's Up, Tiger Lily, it would be a lot like that. And the plan was ultimately dropped when Burr expressed some displeasure with the idea. The American version was released in August of 1985 and made a little over $4 million. The real problem, though, was that it was received pretty overwhelmingly negatively by reviewers and by fans. The Japanese version is the one to watch, and it's considered fairly high quality in contemporary reviews from fans and critics. In fact, due to some crappy copyright issues, Godzilla 1985 isn't even available currently outside of a bootleg because of some music that New World borrowed from one of its other releases. This movie starts somewhat similarly as the original, with a merchant ship getting attacked on the open sea. A few days later, a reporter named Goro Maki takes a look around the ship and finds almost everyone dead. He's attacked by gigantic sea lice and is saved by the only survivor on the boat, Hiroshi Okamura. Now, while Okamura is in the hospital, he realizes that another creature was there besides the lice. He realizes he saw Godzilla. Maki works with Professor Hayashida to study Godzilla further and to try to figure out a way to either destroy Godzilla or, as the plan goes, force him into a volcano to trap him inside. Meanwhile, things are a little sketchy as Godzilla destroys a Soviet submarine. The Soviets are threatening a nuclear attack to kill Godzilla before it goes to Russia. And the Japanese are really nervous about letting the US or the USSR to basically allow them to attack Godzilla with nuclear weapons. The blast may be limited and people could be evacuated, but the fallout is the biggest concern, especially with there being no evidence that Godzilla could even be harmed by nuclear weapons. So they decline the powers to stage a nuclear attack of any kind in or near Japan. Now, the Japanese have a new weapon at their disposal, the so-called Super X, which is it's kind of a special little flying weapon with lasers and stuff to help defend Tokyo. As Godzilla gets to Tokyo, the defenses there are really no match for him. Plus, to make matters worse, a Soviet ship that was docked there in the event of a missile strike is damaged, and the controls begin a countdown for an orbiting Soviet satellite to launch a nuclear attack on Godzilla in Japan. Now, Godzilla cruises almost undeterred into Tokyo. The Super X arrives and fires cadmium missiles, which is able to knock Godzilla out as it slows the nuclear reaction from his heart. So he passes out in the heart of Tokyo, and that Russian satellite fires. So in 30 minutes, that missile is going to hit Tokyo. The Japanese ask for the Americans to try to knock the missile out of the sky in the meantime. All right, so Godzilla seems to be temporarily defeated, but that missile is a bit more of a pressing issue. Meanwhile, Maki and Professor Hayashida have built a machine that will create a homing beacon of sorts that Godzilla responds to. The hope is that they can lure Godzilla to a volcano, explode that volcano, and keep Godzilla inside said volcano. The Americans are able to blow up the Russian missile, but it causes an EMP. That EMP wakes Godzilla up and disables the Super X. Once the Super X gets back up and running, it picks back up with the battle with Godzilla until he finally destroys the weapon. Professor Hayashida gets his homing weapon up and going, and he's able to attract Godzilla to the volcano at Mount Mihara. Now, Godzilla falls in, and Okamura sets off a controlled eruption with explosives, and Godzilla gets trapped inside. The various cast of characters, relieved that Godzilla is defeated, still look on with reverence for the fallen creature that represents some of man's greatest mistakes. So let's get to my 3 things that I like about the Return of Godzilla. First, while I have always had a childlike love for Godzilla the hero, I do like seeing him as a threat again, especially as it mixes with the Cold War tensions of the time. The movie offers ideas about when it is appropriate to use the terrible power we've created as the supreme being on the planet. And not only that, but how fair is it for other countries to make decisions for another? The Japanese Prime Minister asks the leaders of the US and Soviet Union, would they use nuclear weapons if Godzilla was attacking one of their cities? And it was worth them having... was it worth them having to live with that decision to destroy part of their own country? So how do you think they feel as the, as the Japanese, to basically allow outsiders to blow up their nuclear weapons inside Japan's borders. We might think of Japan as a power, but remember, they're really only an economic power. They have a very limited military. So they really are the little guy in this whole thing. Now, second, Godzilla's new look is pretty great. The suit has a great detail inside his mouth where there's even some new articulation in his lips that allow for him to snarl. It's pretty awesome. And yes, he's still a guy in a suit, but this suit looks a lot better than the ones that they had used in the earlier days. He does seem a little scarier too. Now, there are versions of him in the 90s and the early part of the 2000s that make him look even scarier, but this is a pretty good monstrous look for him in his new makeover. Now, finally, I've always loved the look of this movie. It almost looks like a dream or a nightmare. And what I mean by that isn't really easy to explain because it is all connected to how I feel when I see this movie. When I originally saw Godzilla in 1985 as a kid, I saw it on TV. Of course, I refer to it as its American title because I didn't see the original version until only a few years ago when it finally got released on DVD and Blu-ray. There's this haze to this film that always stuck with me. Whether it's an interior shot or an exterior shot, particularly when Godzilla is attacking Tokyo, there's a haze to the images that just doesn't really look sharp to the eye. It feels like something you are hallucinating or dreaming. It also almost feels like a movie that is outside its own time as well. And the reason why it looks like this, especially on the exterior shots at least, is that it is shot on a stage. The sky doesn't look like a sky because, well, there isn't a sky. It doesn't look quite right with the lighting because indoors is lighted differently than the outdoors. And there are a couple of shots where it looks like Godzilla is kind of composited into like an actual skyline of Tokyo. And that looks a lot different in that one scene, in that one shot than the rest of the movie does. And when Godzilla works his way through Tokyo, there's a cleanness and sterile feel to it. Also, I always was in awe of how small Godzilla looked next to the buildings in the city. Now, I've never been to Tokyo, but I know Godzilla is a pretty big dude. And at one point, he is standing next to a building, or at least in a cluster of buildings on the street, that looks to be at least twice as tall as he is. He falls into it when the cadmium shells slow his heart down. But are there buildings in Tokyo that large? I've always asked myself that. And I guess there are like almost 50 buildings that start off taller than like 2 or 3 times the size of Godzilla was in this movie. But it doesn't really matter. This movie still feels like a dream and has a look like no other film in the entire franchise. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later. And don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. You can also check out new posts at my website, bmovieanima.com, each and every Friday.